But what worries me, John, and you're not going to like this because it's looking forward, the June month-on-month print will be worse than the May month-on-month print. I think those who boldly said inflation has peaked and is coming down may have to change their minds. I wouldn't surprise me if we see a headline print that's much higher than the 8.5.
Next month, Mohammed, why?
Not as early as next month, because first, the drivers of inflation are broadening, and that's due to the Fed policy mistake. Secondly, at the headline level, energy prices are going up month on month quite dramatically. And thirdly, we're seeing pressure on shelter and food. So if you look at all the components, it's way too early, unfortunately, to say that inflation has peaked. I hope it has, but it would not surprise me if we go above 8.5% on a yearly basis.
Hey, Mohammed, this is really important. I remember when you gave me the call early last year, and you said, I don't think this is transitory. This is important. I'm pushing back. And you went out there in force, and that force got more powerful as the year progressed. I get the feeling this year, Mohammed, that we still haven't totally relinquished this idea that a lot of this is temporary. I hear from a lot of guests who think that we've seen the peak, a mechanical peak year over year, and for good reason. And they think the Fed backs away in September. Are you stressing this is going to persist through the whole of this year, that we're not going to get that drop-off that so many people are hoping for, looking for?
John, if we get a drop-off, we'll get it for the wrong reason. We'll get it because of demand destruction, and that would be tragic. The last thing we need is for inflation to completely undermine the demand side, because then we have not only a price issue, but we have an income issue. And once again, it will be the most vulnerable segments of the population that get hit the hardest. So in a way, be careful what you wish for. So if you believe the labor market stays strong, wages remain buoyant and start catching up to inflation, then it's very hard to see inflation coming down.
Are bracing themselves for the fallout from Friday's latest consumer price index. That report showing inflation rose 8.6% in May, which is the largest 12-month increase that we have seen since December of 1981. WMAR-2 News' Mark Roper joins us from the live desk this morning. So, Mark, how are economists preparing for what may still be to come with all this?
Good morning, Megan. Well, many financial analysts warn inflation is about to get worse before it gets better, and the Federal Reserve is taking painful steps to try and stop the U.S. economy from heading into a recession. Out-of-control gas prices are driving the high rate of inflation not seen since Ronald Reagan's first year in the Oval Office. The latest consumer price index was released Friday, and the CPI shows inflation continues to climb. It now stands at 8.6%. America's 40-year high inflation has been blamed on everything from a tight labor market to COVID, Russia's war in Ukraine, and government spending. Grocery prices are up nearly 12% from a year ago. The largest spikes are for the cost of eggs, meat, and bread, the highest increases since 1979. And gas prices nationwide now average more than $5 a gallon. The Federal Reserve is expected to raise key interest rates by a half point on Wednesday. Making it more expensive to borrow money is an effort to cool spending just enough to curb inflation, but without sending the economy into a recession. Some analysts expect interest rates could rise by 0.75 of a point in the months ahead.
Maybe aggressively, 50, maybe a 75, until we really get inflation under control. And that means, frankly, risking the possibility of, as Chairman Powell said, some pain.
Now we'll have to wait until Wednesday to see how much the Fed raises interest rates, which not only affects financial investors, but can trickle down to everyday consumers. If banks have to charge more to lend to each other, then the interest rates on car loans, mortgages, and credit cards also can go up.
Well, let's start with inflation, where everybody else is starting. It's reported the highest level in just over 40 years. How did we get here, and are things going to get worse?
We got here because we got a combination of things happening. Of course, we know about the Ukraine war. We know about the energy transition. Also, the Federal Reserve mischaracterized inflation and fell behind. And all these things came together and are feeding now this everything inflation. The price of nearly everything is going up, and it's making us feel really insecure.
There was some hope in some quarters. It may have been motivated reasoning, but there was some hope that inflation might be turning around, the picture might be getting better. So give us your sense, was that hope misplaced, or is this a sign of how hard it is to predict where we are in the economy at this moment?
It's both. There was hope initially that it is transitory, meaning temporary and quickly reversible. There was hope, as you pointed out, that it had peaked. I never shared those hopes. I think you've got to be very modest about what we know about this inflation process. And I fear that it's still going to get worse. We may well get to 9% at this rate.
I want to get back to that point about modesty, but staying on inflation, how much is this a part of what's domestic U.S. issues? You mentioned some of them. How much of it is what's happening overseas?
It started mainly external, exogenous, if you like, things that we imported. But then the Federal Reserve did not react. It mischaracterized what inflation is, and it fell behind. And the lessons of history is once you fall behind, you lose the ability of the first best response. You end up in this awful situation that we're in today, where you need to make a choice. Do you slam on the brakes hard to control inflation and risk a recession, or do you just tap on the brakes and risk inflation lasting much longer than it should?
So does that mean the Federal Reserve is in the second best response, or are they in the third or fourth best response?
Well, the problem for us all is they're far away from the first best response. I mean, what makes this very frustrating is it was partially avoidable. This is going to have enormous economic, social, it hits the poor particularly hard, institutional, and political consequences. And most of it could have been avoided had early actions been taken.
Looking at what the Federal Reserve is doing, raising rates to try to push down on demand, how is that story going? And will these new numbers, how do you think these new numbers will affect what the Federal Reserve is going to do going forward?
So it's not going well so far because the Fed is yet to explain to us why it got its forecast so wrong for so long. The European Central Bank, they were in the same position. They've explained why. And that's important because until you regain credibility, you cannot get on top of inflationary expectations. We should look the Fed to increase by at least 50 basis points this coming week.
Those expectations, the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey showed that people's fears about inflation in the future was going up. Is that related to that lack of confidence in the Fed's ability to bring prices down?
It is. Long-term inflation expectations are now 3.3%, the highest we've seen them for 15 years. People are losing confidence in the ability of the Fed to get a handle on this inflation process. So,
Mohamed, implicit in everything you've been saying and we've been talking about is the murkiness of the picture. Economics is always a little murky. Are we at an extra murky period right now? And does that mean all policymakers are essentially flying, if not blind? They're dealing with something we've never seen before, and therefore humility is even more called for in policy prescriptions.
So humility is totally called for. I was very puzzled when a year ago so many people were so confident that inflation was transitory. There was so much we didn't understand about the post-COVID inflation that humility would have been a good idea. Unfortunately, today, there's a few things we know for sure. This inflation is hurting all Americans, and it's hurting the poor particularly hard. That we know for sure. Second, the longer it lasts, the more it's going to create demand destruction, meaning that the average American not only get hit by higher prices, but they will start worrying about their income. And that is not a situation that we really want to be in.